Hello, everybody. Welcome again to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today we have Andrew at _St. Drew on Twitter and Andrewism on YouTube. Andrew, you came across my attention. Somebody recommended you for the podcast. I looked up your content on YouTube. I've been digging into it. I think your content is great. Just really quality
Thank you.
stuff. Yeah, and you just cover such a wide range of topics, very comprehensively, and also it's very entertaining as well, right? It's not just information; it's also very entertaining. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate being here and being able to engage in this conversation.
Yeah, great. So why don't we start by you just kind of introducing yourself, your background, as much as you want to reveal, of course, and kind of the kind of evolution of your political consciousness and your activity and kind of what you're up to and what you're aiming for.
Sure. I'm Andrew, first and foremost. Born, raised, grew up, still living in Trinidad and Tobago. It's the southernmost Caribbean country, unless you count in Guyana. I have really just been into I've always been a very curious person, very knowledge information explorative sort of person. Um, and when I eventually began learning about, climate change, that kind of thing, it really was sort of opened that door into other elements of politics. Prior to that, I was, due to my upbringing, leaning a bit conservative. But due to a variety of factors, including my move away from religion, and my pursuit of socialist and anarchist politics is when I really started to get into what I am now, which is an anarchist. I think one of the main driving forces for me has been sort of the existential reality of my generation of climate change and of really the social and economic pressures that we are under and millennials are under as a result of the machinations of capitalism and the state. And so that has really driven me to want to learn as much as possible about the issues that currently exist and also to explore the solutions, because I think one of the main mistakes that some make that probably lends them more to the doomerism side than the optimism side, or the realism side even, is hyper focus on the negatives and the downfalls and the pitfalls, not so much the solutions that are being put into place that exist that people around the world are pursuing to make life a bit better, to mitigate the worst consequences, to carve out a new world in the shell of the old. And so that is really what I try to point people towards through my work, and just something that I generally try to focus on in my life so that I don't get dragged down by, everything.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of our approach as well, where we don't want to be naive or have rose-colored glasses on of what's really going on in the world, and that's where the doomerism part comes in. But it's a recognition that you can't stop there. Doomerism itself is fatalistic; it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and so there
Exactly.
needs to be a pragmatic vision forward. And maybe this can be a gateway into. We recently had Anarch on the podcast, and we talked about anarchism and this idea of prefiguration, of starting to, create the society that we want to see in the world, crafting the new in the shell of the old, as you said. Do you want to kind of talk about what that looks like for you, just on a personal level, but also a community level, and then a broader networks that you're a part of?
So I suppose on a personal level, what I'm doing to prefigure has really been focused in my own backyard, with my own garden, and really taking it seriously, in particular this year, trying to develop my skills, I've done some courses in gardening, permaculture, and it's really trying to pursue that and develop my understanding of that so that I could share that with others and slowly develop the broader food autonomy. My focus is really on permaculture and that sort of thing at this point in time. However, I know that there are other aspects that need to be pursued as well. On a personal level, I've also been a part of and founded various smaller scale, organizations, reading groups, book clubs, that sort of thing, to sort of spread consciousness. And in the long term, I think one of my main focuses would be to establish some sort of space for education and outreach and food autonomy on this island and really in the region as a whole. But I know that's not all that there is that can be done. It's just what I believe my focus needs to be.
Yeah.
On the broader sort of community level and above, I know that at least on the prefigurative side, there is a lot that needs to be done. You don't exactly build a whole new world in, the flip of a switch or the snap of the fingers. It takes a lot to transform people's powers, drives, and consciousness in ways that are conducive to anarchic social change. Powers being, people's capacity to do or to be, which is determined by their natural, historical, and social context. Because of the situation we've been placed in, people do not have the ability to self-manage because that hasn't been taught. In fact, that has been taught out of them. And so it needs to be relearned and developed. Those skills and powers need to be developed in order to organize horizontally and spread this form of organization to others. And in doing so, we would develop and appreciate those free and equal social relations and enhance our drives to pursue them even further, because the drives that we have are shaped by our social context. And of course, our consciousness, our understanding of the world around us, to assess the world around us, to orient ourselves in the world around us, and to change the world around us is also quite vital in just the practice of prefigurative politics. I think, of course, mutual aid networks are a crucial component in that. And that really takes various forms. I think in some cases, the term mutual aid has been used to just seem more enlightened, or like a more enlightened form of charity, when in reality, the practice is just charity. But mutual aid is more expansive and more in-depth and more collaborative than charity is. And I think I really hope that people are able to really dig into the depth of what mutual aid can be, rather than just limiting itself to the sort of dimensions of charitable work and the sort of NGO space. I think survival programs are also important, help to feed and house people. Popular assemblies, as we've seen again and again, have been an essential part of the revolutionary momentum of the masses in creating and developing and conceiving new social relations and new systems, and getting involved in direct decision making over the things that affect us directly. And of course, how that manifests will take on different forms. I think there's a sort of a meme of like anarchists just want everybody to be in meetings all day. But I think it's important to have that sort of free association element of it, to have people, to maintain people's choice to engage or to disengage, to have their say or to not have their say, to really maintain that those affected by a situation should be the ones to make a decision on it, and to also have the flexibility to allow for other forms of decision making when the situation may call for it. And so I do talk about that a bit in my channel. I do intend to talk about that even further in the future. But we've seen popular assemblies in Argentina, in Mexico, during the Paris Commune, during the Spanish Revolution. There have been many such successes of popular assemblies. And I do believe that it is crucial, it is a pillar of any sort of successful prefigurative movement. Another element of it, another crucial pillar, I would say, would be the development of food autonomy through whether it be, urban agriculture, community support agriculture, permaculture, all of those things working together to develop people's ability to feed themselves and to care for themselves, separate from the whims of the market. And I think part of that sort of, crop share initiative would have to be things like, farmers cooperatives and other kinds of workers cooperatives, which I think are also essential. Of course, there are limitations under the current structure of the capitalist market economy, but they do have a place. I would also say the commons are another crucial component, because the deprivation of the commons, the removal of the commons, the enclosure of the commons is really what put us in this situation in the first place. Is one of the elements that developed modern capitalism, that removed access to common resources, to common land, and other such arrangements of land access to the means of subsistence, in order to force people into arrangements with capitalists and landlords.
Right. I'm curious. So we're having this conversation. I live in the United States, and you're putting out. You have a Twitter account, and you have the YouTube channel, and so there's definitely kind of a broader network building, and this is definitely also an affordance that wasn't available, say, 20 or 30 years ago. And I'm curious
Right.
what you think about kind of this affordance of this new digital technology in kind of helping along this prefigurative politics, especially in terms of like global solidarity, that wasn't there in the past. Like, are you hopeful? Obviously, there's many things wrong with the internet in terms of the ownership structures right now. It's very much a capitalistic ownership structure for the most part. But there's also, kind of this new Web3 movement that is very much geared towards peer-to-peer kind of networking and decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, things of that nature. Curious your thoughts on, how this new technology can be used, can give the movement a leg up compared to what was possible, say, 30 years ago.
So I'm definitely of the belief that when it comes to the internet, there's a lot of potential. There's also, of course, a lot of risk associated with that because of the sort of disconnection. I mean, we did evolve as a social species, as a face-to-face species. That sort of facial expression, body language, or understanding, and just sort of connection, can be lost on the internet. And I think that's why it's been so easy for people to sort of lose their empathy, ability to engage with people in good faith online. However, that aside, online is really a powerful space. The internet is really a powerful space that will allow us to connect across vast distances like never before, to really grow in solidarity with one another like never before. Obviously, digital inclusion, privatization, the rise of tech monopolies, artificial scarcity, all those things have hampered the potentials of the internet. But much like I speak about in my library economy video, there's also a lot of potential, a lot of unrealized possibilities within the internet to bring us closer together. As for how it relates specifically to international solidarity, so I think as we've seen in the protests of 2020 that really went global against police brutality, from Colombia to Nigeria to the US to Canada to Ethiopia, there have been a lot of uprisings and protests and movements as a whole over the 21st century that have been defined by the use of technology, of the internet, to connect people, to assist, to pressure for the release of various political prisoners. And this age of communication has a lot of potential. I think one of the most effective ways that we can develop these sort of solidarity networks, first and foremost, an understanding of the cultural differences and linguistic differences between people, and understanding of the boundaries that would be necessary to establish and develop in those sorts of interactions, and also to, how do I say this? I think the most important element of developing, international solidarity would be online, at least, would be to make sure it does not remain online. Make sure that that solidarity does not exist solely in terms of expressing verbal support, but that support also flows materially, physically, financially, if necessary.
Yeah, I was going to say that's one of kind of the movements or trends that I'm pretty bullish on is this thing called cosmo-localism, which is this idea where you kind of have this global commons of information and design. So oftentimes it's thought of in terms of like manufacturing, for example, for like distributed technology, kind of DIY, say small scale tractors or other machinery, where all of
Like
this.
what open source ecology is doing.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's a whole movement. So open source ecology is one of the premier examples of what they're developing. And then a fellow named Michelle Bowens, he put out a report called Peer-to-Peer Commons Manifesto that tries to, and many others as well, that try to kind of lay out what are kind of the design protocols for basically encouraging both local autonomies and kind of diversity, of expressions. So, having a pluralistic kind of expression of culture in place. So it has this like localist element, but then it also has kind of the cosmopolitan elements of exchange of knowledge and information and culture when appropriate, when that's a free exchange of cultural elements. And so
Right.
it's a pretty, it's one of those movements that couldn't have been possible without the advent of the internet, and it's still really not, it hasn't really achieved its mature form yet. But it seems, at least to me, it seems pretty hopeful.
Yeah, it really is exciting to see. And of course, open source ecology hasn't completed their project yet. They're still very much in the early stages of developing that global village construction set, but it is exciting to see. And it's definitely something that I hope to be able to utilize in the future.
Yeah. Well, let's switch gears a little bit to Solarpunk. And Solarpunk is kind of a vision of the way forward. Do you want to talk about Solarpunk, kind of what you make of the movement, what inspires you about it, as well as any critiques that you might have?
Sure. So Solarpunk is essentially a movement and a vision and an aesthetic and a genre that sort of looks to a positive, shining vision of the future, aesthetic and practical, that is mainly focused on bridging the chasm between the human society and natural world and using technology in ways that can facilitate that connection rather than cut us off from that connection. It has a lot of emphasis on sustainability, on social justice, on autonomy, and of course, those things have made it very attractive to various anti-capitalist movements, made it very attractive to me, even prior to my full exploration and then sort of delve into anarchism. Solarpunk was always something I was very much interested in. And I think it is a very powerful sort of tool or vision because of how attractive it is. People who have fallen into the trap of doomerism have come and they've told me that the vision of Solarpunk has motivated me to move forward. I think one of the great losses of the 21st century is the fact that we've lost a sense of a future to work towards, of some sort of vision, some sort of positive vision of utopia to strive towards. And Solarpunk, in a sense, offers that. Of course, Solarpunk isn't perfect. Not every manifestation of it is perfect. And in fact, there are certain mistakes that people who pursue Solarpunk, people in the climate movement and stuff, sort of fall into. A lot of Solarpunk aesthetics, a lot of the most popular visuals of Solarpunk, some that I've ended up using myself, though I would now say that they were flawed, would be there is a bit of greenwashing in Solarpunk, at least in the visual side of Solarpunk. It is something that has begun to be critiqued. People have begun to critique that aspect of some of the manifestations and ideas behind it. But because it's not a centralized movement, it is something that some people will still sort of fall into. But whether it be in, agriculture and fashion and architecture, Solarpunk artwork has a habit of sometimes falling into that sort of greenwashing thing that sort of falls into popular notions of greenness, puts forward like an environmentally friendly image, but it's like green shrubbery and stuff on concrete skyscrapers. It's not necessarily actually ecological, it just looks pretty. I think also there is a habit in some cases, in some segments of the Solarpunk movement, I suppose, to sort of overly optimistically embrace technology, even where it is not necessary, even where, and particularly high technology, quote unquote, even where low technology and low tech, DIY solutions may be more effective, indigenous solutions may be more effective than, some of the methods that are put forward. We have to be conscious of the limitations of the planet, of the limitations of, our access to rare earth minerals and metals, and not wanting to perpetuate the exploitative labor conditions that produce many of these technologies. And so I think an over-reliance and overly optimistic embrace of technology can be an occasional pitfall of the Solarpunk movement. And of course, as is just across the board, of course, there will be people within Solarpunk who sort of fall into this soft climate change denial. I think it's the standard really across the environmental movement as a whole, but it's a state of mind that acknowledges the existence of climate change, but is kind of in denial about its reality or its impact. It's understandable that people fall into that because, the scientists who study climate change are largely very depressed. But I think it's a mistake to sort of cordon off such emotionally challenging information from the rest of our mind. We need to engage with the scope of the crisis, and in order to imagine a path forward, in order to mitigate. And I think when people miscalculate the risks, or neglect the existential urgency, or underestimate the extent of social change required, because a lot of people are very, centrist status quo, it leads to a toothless and middling approach to climate movements, and a very limited vision of what Solarpunk can be. But I think avoiding those sorts of limitations will enable Solarpunk to be a very effective force in mobilizing people, in particular young people who, have seen the potentials of, things like walkable cities and the beauty of natural environments and the sort of general aestheticization of young people's approach to life, this generation's approach to life, due to the sort of sense of us being constantly in performance. Having that sort of aesthetic vision, I think, is going to be crucial in pushing people forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think that a trap that the environmentalist movement falls into is actually two things. Is one, as you said, kind of not really grappling with the extent of the problem, such that we can kind of just continue business as usual, but try and say unplug fossil fuels and plug in renewable energy and quote unquote renewable energy into our grid, and then everything will be fine. But then there's also a tendency of like you need to really sacrifice you as an individual. You're so consumeristic, and you need to sacrifice, and so there's kind of like this both dour strain and this kind of techno utopian strain.
Yeah.
And both of those, I think, we're in agreement here that both those are problematic. One, because we can't maintain our current energy and materials throughput globally, but especially in the distribution that we've seen it up until now. The vast unequal distribution of those things. And but two, the vision put forward to address these things doesn't have to be dour. It can be actually quite joyful and reconnecting with a sense of place and with each other and with ecology, and all of these things. And then of course you get things like there was recently a Chobani ad for like a Solarpunk Chobani ad, and it was kind of, if you didn't know the context, it was kind of like, oh, this is kind of a beautiful vision, but it's a
It's something that I did use, the visuals of which I did use, but now I'm a bit more critical of.
yeah, exactly. And so
I think
then
it's easy to get caught up in those sort of visuals, you know. But I mean, some of the things presented are definitely impractical, like a localized sort of. I think one of the clips was like a localized rain shower or
right,
something like that, and some kind of like really high tech water filtration system. It's just like a whole thing.
right. And so yeah, so it definitely, well, it had, it was like kind of a greenwashing, kind of a private large corporate kind of uh you know what's the word, you know I can't think of the word, basically taking aesthetic vision and using it for to sell more
Right,
products,
that
right?
co-optation.
Co-optation, that's exactly the
I
word.
think
Yeah,
well, and I agree with that. However, I don't think I don't necessarily. I'm partially because I fell for it in a sense myself, like not fully, but I did kind of fall in love with the visuals a bit. Um, I think part of it, the reason I don't fault people for it is because we're so starved of hopeful visuals that people have latched on to the sort of scraps that we've gotten from, you know, well, the corporation didn't make the animation. They hired an animation studio to make it, but you know, um, just it really goes to show that we're so lacking in positive visuals in present day that we're latching on to commercials from yogurt companies, you know?
right. Yeah. Well, this might be a good segue. You mentioned, kind of oftentimes there's kind of a techno utopian bent, or the proposal of technologies that might not even be appropriate, when a lower tech option might be more appropriate. And this might feed into kind of, you've talked about on the channel, of degrowth. And there's a lot of people who I think are degrowthers, but they don't really like the name degrowth, because it implies that they would say that, well, we want to grow in other ways. We want to grow in human connection. We want to grow in, say, human equality. We want to grow our ecological base through kind of regenerative practices. And they would agree that, hey, we definitely need to reduce our throughput, our linear throughput. But they have kind of a knee jerk reaction against the term degrowth itself. Before we get into like what degrowth is, do you have any thoughts about that, of like the branding of degrowth? Do you think it's a good branding, or do you think it could be improved?
Yeah. Me personally, I've definitely felt that way as well. And I understand the arguments on both sides. I understand the need for something that is confrontational in terms of terminology that forces us to confront um, this sort of blind acceptance of economic growth as just like a baseline, everybody's ultimate good sort of thing. Um, but then at the same time, at the same time, I also feel as though it just falls into the same trap that I've been talking about, where we get into this habit of just criticizing and talking about the problems and what's wrong and focusing on those things. And instead of, which is demobilizing, to be quite frank, rather than focusing on change, on um, proposals, and proposing a different vision, which is why I say so often on my channel, it's oppose and propose. If you're just opposing, if you're putting forth yourself as just standing against something, you're just going to look like, just a loud critic with nothing to back it up. What you want is you want to push the conversation forward. You want to put people in a position where instead of shrugging their shoulders and saying, yeah, well, it sucks, but I mean, what alternative is there? You want them to be like, oh, so this is the alternative.
Right, right.
And so that's why I'm more of an advocate for using terms like post growth, buen vivir, that kind of thing.
Right. Right. It seems it just occurred to me that it seems like degrowth is kind of like this confrontational kind of stance, and then maybe
Which has
soul,
its place, definitely.
which has its place. Yeah. So the propose and oppose. So the saying degrowth is kind of the oppositional position, and then something like Solarpunk then brings in the propositional vision of
Yeah.
this is actually something that we can work towards with with joy and enthusiasm.
Yep.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I guess a way, I guess, entry into this discussion of degrowth is, and I think people oftentimes confuse this. People often, when they hear degrowth, you're saying, oh, so you just want this kind of major recession. And we know that in a capitalist economy, recession usually hits the working class and the poor the hardest. Whereas maybe a super wealthy billionaire maybe has to give up one or two of their many yachts or something. But for the most part, it's the poor and working class who face bear the brunt of it, and they don't get bailed out like others do. And they'll say, "Oh, that so you're just advocating for a recession, which we have these traumatic memories of." Do you want to talk about kind of what kind of the proposition of degrowth is, and how it differs from that reaction?
Sure. I'll start by addressing the reaction to degrowth. My whole thing is with people's reaction to the criticisms of it is that the vast majority of cases, the people who are criticizing it are either criticizing it from a place of dishonesty or criticizing it from a place of ignorance. Because a lot of the critiques that are brought up for degrowth are things that are directly addressed by the critiques and the proposals that degrowth presents. It bears repeating, degrowth is not austerity. Degrowth, and I mean, it's right on the Degrowth website. It means transforming societies to ensure environmental justice and a good life for all within planetary boundaries. It's about critiquing the global capitalist system that pursues growth at all costs, causing human exploitation and environmental destruction. Degrowth is about a radical redistribution and of the wealth that exists now and a reduction in the material size of the global economy, which is built upon this idea of economic growth and production and consumerism for the sake of it, and shifting towards common values, towards care, towards solidarity, towards autonomy. Degrowth, as one of its most essential goals, is striving for a self-determined life and dignity for all. A society and an economy sustains the natural basis of life, an extension of democratic decision making. So I think when people who may only be able to conceive of things in terms of policy proposals and not necessarily in terms of, mass mobilization and bottom up organizing and social revolution, when they think degrowth, they think, oh, well, the politicians are just gonna make us all downsize and force us to struggle or whatever. And it's like the whole vision and proposal of degrowth is so contrary to what everybody is putting forward in the mainstream political sphere. They would not want to touch such a proposal with a 10-foot pole. There is no real radicalism in parliamentary politics. And so that sort of vision, what degrowth will require, would be a bottom-up mass mobilization of people. And when you have that bottom-up mass mobilization of people, you have people directly involved in decision-making, you have people directly involved in the transformation, in the social revolution. And they're not going to go through all that just to make their lives worse. They're doing it to make their lives better, to create a better life for all of us to enjoy. As we've seen, we've known about climate change for so long, but politicians have not done what it would take. Capitalists have ensured that nothing will be done that will actively threaten their interests. And degrowth is saying, well, screw your interests. We are going to pursue the interests of the people and of the earth. And that is the focus of it. And I think getting caught up in complete misrepresentations or misunderstandings of it is just, it's unfortunate and it's disappointing to see.
Do you think that is the degrowth movement unified? And by that I mean, is there kind of a split between kind of a more statist planned management form of kind of top down form of degrowth and more of a bottom up deliberative form of degrowth? Do you see that, or not? I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
I think I'm certainly like a newcomer to the degrowth scene. I've known about it for years, but I've only really started exploring it further in the past few months. So I wouldn't really be able to speak on, because I haven't read as much literature to be able to say that, this and this author is more on the statist side, this and this author is more on the anarchist side. I know there's certainly statist approaches to degrowth, people who sort of pursue that, but even in that, they really do try to emphasize the masses. And of course, they're the more revolutionary sort of bottom-up approaches, such as myself, that would emphasize that we cannot rely on those institutions to go against their own interests and liberate us. We must liberate ourselves. We must work to liberate the planet.
Yeah. Kind of a broad question. In terms of kind of theories of change and prefiguration, and when like kind of the conditions, when the conditions are ripe, so to speak. Do you think that, like, say, ecological collapse or climate change, do you think it has to get much worse before the conditions are right, or do you think that the conditions can be right sooner in order to be more kind of proactive in terms of this revolutionary change that you're talking about?
I read recently that the possibility of revolution is not based on the direness of the circumstances that people are placed in, because much like a frog in boiling water, I know it's an analogy that is not bear out in reality, but much like a frog in boiling water, people can adapt and adjust even the worst of circumstances. They will sit and they will boil if necessary. What really pushes people to action is not necessarily how bad the situation is, but more so whether they've been able to evaluate that they have a chance of success, of succeeding in their aims, that they have a vision of what they want to see changed, and that they believe that they can execute that change successfully. Of course, that evaluation may not always live up to reality. And of course, there have been many mass mobilizations that have ended in failure. But we've also seen, large populations that vastly outnumber their oppressors, just continuing to live with oppression because, the working class vastly outnumbers the 1%, vastly outnumbers the capitalist class. And yet we will sit and continue to deal with these circumstances, deal with this, austerity, deal with recession, deal with the deprivation of our quality of life, because, we don't see a vision, we don't see a path of success. We've so been beaten down. And so I think that what it will take is not waiting for the situation to get worse. What it will take is showing people, demonstrating to people through prefigurative politics that there is another way and that we can develop a new way of life. That new way of life is better, and that this old way of life is holding us back from achieving that. When somebody feels as if they're being held back or limited, once we they get a taste of what could be, even the barest bones of what could be, I think that is far more motivating than just, the price of bread went up again, or the price of gas went up again, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to make rent, and I don't know if I'll be able to eat dinner tonight, that kind of thing. I think we need more than that. I think we need a vision and a strategy.
Right. What's we've talked about we've touched on a little bit of kind of anarchist prefiguration and solarpunk and degrowth. What's really at kind of the tip of your interest right now, the thing that's really most exciting to you and thinking about, and also in doing? Is there kind of like, or maybe this could be phrased as the next set of videos that you're hoping to put out, or next set of kind of processes that you're engaged with? Do you want to, I don't know, do you care to speak
Sure.
on what's freshest, what's most vital, seems most vital to you right now?
Right now, I really want to explore the process of decolonization further. I believe decolonization of our minds, of our landscapes, of our places, will be a vital aspect of social revolution. And so I believe understanding decolonization will be important, and pushing that conversation in more anarchic directions also be important, because I think a lot of the way that decolonization has been conceived is just, formal political independence, independent states, that kind of thing. And having lived in a post-colonial nation, I've seen that has done, formal political independence has not decolonized us, symbolically, spatially, administratively, socially, nothing. And so a lot more needs to be done in that respect, and something I want to look into more in the coming year. I also want to continue to drill more into the practical side of things, in terms of how we pursue, how we shape our social relationships, how we organize politically, how we approach our movements. And then I also want to continue to look into history, as I always have, because I find it very fascinating. I want to look more into the ways that we can transform and develop new economies, drawing inspiration from economies of old. And
Yeah.
and I'd like to reveal as well that I'm working on a video on the working title for now is Solarpunk City Planning.
Okay. Nice. Are there, you said you like to look into kind of the history of kind of successful anarchic kind of experiments in the past. Are there any in particular that you draw special inspiration from, of of just things that have movements that have been really successful, and that you draw inspiration from?
So for me, I definitely use the term anarchic as opposed to anarchist, because I draw inspiration from all sorts of situations and all sorts of organizations, movements that are not necessarily anarchist, but do have broadly anarchic elements within them. And by anarchic, I mean, broadly horizontal, egalitarian, directly democratic, elements of, free association, and resistance to hierarchical forms of organization, if not outright abolition of such forms of hierarchy. And I draw some inspiration from these Zapatistas, of course. I think they're one of my major driving forces. I think the Spanish Revolution was another interesting experiment, and also, though not necessarily anarchic, lately I have been looking to the Maroons, and Maroon societies, as just a sort of an inspiration in terms of their refusal to cooperate, their abandonments, their escape, and their resistance to the, globe-spanning colonial empires that existed in their period of resistance, and how some of them have endured to this day.
Nice. Curious what else besides what we've covered so far, are there other topics that you want to explore together?
I suppose as a sort of a fun closing question, where do you see this decade going?
Wow. Well,
I know, a very fun question to ask.
Yeah. Well, I'll preface it by saying that I don't know, and I try not to be overly certain about the future. But with that
Likewise.
said, I think that in this next decade, we're probably, I mean, I can, mainly speak about kind of the United States context. I think that we're going to start seeing energy shocks to the system. I think that the energy return on investments of a lot of the fossil fuel extraction is going to start going down. And I don't think that, the alternatives in terms of solar voltaic and wind turbines and hydroelectric and nuclear I don't think that they're going to cover completely cover the deficit. And so I think that there are going to be these energy shocks, which will ripple out throughout the system, right? Because it's connected to not just operational energy of, lighting, things like that, but also the whole economy, right? Industrial processes, food production. I think coupled with that, I think food production is going to become much more central in people's kind of salience landscape, where suddenly the food showing up in the supermarket and the prices and that's that people see for them, suddenly there's going to be just more insecurity in terms of food availability. And so I think there's going to be a lot, there's going to start to be more concern about localized food production. And I think, more people in the United States context, at least, it's only like 1 or 2% of the population at this point is engaged with agriculture. And I think that's going to have to change, right? I just think many more people are going to have to be involved with food production at some scale, whether it's urban agriculture, growing things, on apartment decks and on rooftops and things of that nature, as well as suburban lawns being ripped up and planted with edibles, as well as, just more people involved with the land. Now, something I'm not certain about is the accessibility, how accessible that will be to people who want to engage with the food production, right? So we have a very kind of concentrated ownership structure of land, where you have a few big players, large scale farmers, and a lot of young people, especially where I am, a lot of young people want to get into food production and agriculture, but they just can't get on any land. And so I think that there's going to be rising conflicts over promoting access to land. And hopefully there will be responses, that some of which I'm hopeful about. One is like the community land trust movement, or cooperative movements, where figuring out how we can get people access to land, without necessarily, without them needing to be able to afford, at this point, just the exorbitant prices, of kind of land, the commodified land structure that we see today. And so I think that's going to become much more central. Um, yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
and
I
it happens to be that's my central, like one of my central interests are food systems, and so it tends to be just what I think about a lot. But yeah, I think especially in the United States, people have taken food for granted, and that's going to change. And then last thing here, in terms of conflicts and over access, I think just the necessity of building up the skill sets, right? Hopefully the development of like field schools, of developing the skills of, say, agroecology or permaculture, to actually not just get on some land, but actually know what to do with it, and how to steward the land well, and also feed the local populations. And so I just think that's going to become more central.
I agree. I agree. And like you, I shudder to make any broad predictions or proclamations. But I do see access to land as like a major uh issue, especially considering um I mean millennials and now Gen Z are adults, and adults that are largely landless, they're largely unable to access, it's one of the basics
Mhm.
of, life. Um, and the community land trust movement is something that I'm also very much inspired by, something I intend to pursue in my own personal life. Um, but I definitely see that sort of frustration, and I think it goes beyond just lack of housing and stuff, or rising prices of food. I think people are just getting increasingly frustrated by what Craig would call the BS jobs, by really just work culture in general. I see a lot of frustrations bubbling up from that, and as I see, especially in my generation, a lot of people sort of pulling back from that sort of hustle culture, and um having experienced things like work from home, how that's going to affect things as well. I think part of the whole work from home experience is the fact that because people have demonstrated that they've been able to work from home, um, a lot of companies are going to take those jobs and put them where they would be cheaper, because if you can work from home, you can work from anywhere. And so I think there's going to be even greater losses in jobs, gains in jobs in poorer countries. But speaking for Trinidad, at least, one of the major call center companies, they constantly bleed workers because the work conditions are so depressingly horrible. Um, I mean, the cost of living is just getting worse and worse. Prices just across the board are going up. Crime is really threatening people's lives and livelihoods. Um, and yeah, it's really what a time to be alive.
Yeah. Yeah, it's simultaneously kind of a horrifying time to be alive, but also a very exciting time to be alive. And I don't always know how to how to relate to both of those kind of simultaneous feelings about it.
But I guess that's the purpose of the podcast.
Right, right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. One of the things we emphasize a lot on the podcast is, figuring out, uh, given, any given person's kind of access to resources, to land, what are ways that we as individuals and communities and say, larger localities, say even bioregions, how can we support each other to start taking agency wherever it lies, whether it's as small as, say, you live in a dense apartment complex, what are forms of kind of self-production that you can engage with up and until you have the ability to kind of spread your wings, right? So whether it's like you can't grow anything, but perhaps you could do a lot of post processing, like you can make bread, you can do fermentation, you can, there's ways to kind of build up, even at a very small scale, like local autonomies. And the more kind of economic independence you can build at whatever scale, the more political independence, perhaps, hopefully, can come down the road. Um,
Yeah.
and so it's like two parts of the question of like, how do we expand access, but also how do we maximize this kind of individual and collective agency at wherever you find yourself, wherever you happen to be. You have a 6x6 plot of land in, a tiny little backyard. Okay, well, there's a lot actually that you can do with that, right?
Yeah.
And even if it's marginal in terms of, say, feeding your family, it's building up the patterns. It's this prefiguration of, the skills that when the conditions change, like it's just, we're all bursting at the seams, ready to, to kind of expand these practices, and these kinds of mentalities.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I'm curious. You asked me a question about like the next 10 years, and I could really speak up in the United States context. What about in your context? What do you have besides what you've said already? You kind of mentioned what's happening in Trinidad and Tobago, but are any other kind of hesitant predictions in the next 10 years that you foresee?
Well, I see, um, I mean, brain drain has been a continuous force in many post-colonial countries, especially in the Caribbean. So I do see a lot of, emigration, um, combined with, of course, the immigration of Venezuelan refugees. I think it's going to create, and of course, wherever there's migration, there's an element of xenophobia. Um, I think it's I hope that there isn't a greater upsurge in that sort of prejudice, but I do think that is a possibility. Um, but just looking at the way that things are going, and just the incompetence that the government so regularly exhibits, and just the way that our system has been set up, it's effectively two parties, and not both are completely out of touch and not seen as reflective of the needs of the population. And yet, I suppose as a consequence of our education, people still look to parliamentary politics as a solution. But I think there will be a push, hopefully, towards looking locally and sort of at least writing off, if not actively opposing, um, the government's continued mismanagement of our country.
Yeah, yeah. Um, is there an active kind of scene of revolutionary politics in your country? Is there?
Unfortunately, no.
No. Okay.
There used to be a very active Caribbean left,
Mhm.
but it's post. I think it really reached its peak in the 70s, but it's kind of been on the decline since then, and there aren't any outspoken um, or mainstream voices on the left, and there also isn't a very large. There is a subculture, but there's not a very large subculture of left politics. And I think a lot of the more radical and revolutionary people have been are sort of scattered across the country. It's not like a major sort of network with strong ties in place, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah. Let me know if this question is too personal, but how is like in terms of your interactions with your family and say friends growing up, um, how is how have those relationships changed? Do they see you as kind of just crazy, or are they kind of on board, or something else?
I think for the most part, I think people are receptive to my critiques and to my proposals and whatnot. But while they may agree, that doesn't necessarily translate to action or to their own pursuit of exploring these politics. Um, I think part of that is just exhaustion. I think people as a whole are just really, really tired. And so they don't necessarily have the energy to engage with and to pursue these things further. But I mean, for the most part, I've gotten nothing but agreement in terms of my critiques and my ideas, even from family members who may be more on the conservative side of things, they would still agree with a lot of the proposals that I would push forward. But it's just translating that into action
Mhm.
has been a struggle.
Yeah, yeah. What about like we mentioned a bit about like permaculture, agroecology. Is there a kind of a movement or kind of do you see a growing interest in these kind
I
of
do.
alternative
I,
food?
I do see a growing interest in permaculture, and that is thanks to the folks at Wasamaki Ecosystems. I think they're one of they're the main, if not the only, permaculture site, at least accessible to the public. Um, and they have various courses and classes and stuff. And I do see budding interest in that. And they have been able to develop their reach and stuff. And so, I think that is something that has potential to grow even further because I think most people have at least some semblance of a kitchen garden and they want to like develop that more with the prices and of everything going up.
Right. Okay, so that's interesting because many parts of the United States don't have lost even that, right? Like in many places in the United States, there's a household, there's a neighborhood organization called HOA where they actually
Right.
prohibit, like gardens or kind of local food production more generally, maybe backdoor chickens or backyard chickens or something like that. Luckily, where I live in kind of the southern Appalachians, and there's still a culture here of kind of local food production. You still see a lot of folks with their backyard or front yard gardens or small scale kind of livestock production, and that's for me it's very hopeful for me in terms of being here is that it's like you don't like the cultural memory is there. And so that seems I'm glad to hear, you know, that unlike many parts of the United States, that hasn't gone away for you all as well. And it can be kind of built upon and expanded upon.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there are pockets that just need to be expanded. Sparks and seeds that just need to be developed further.
Yeah, yeah. Is there like a particular, you would say, bottleneck? Like, is it like in the United States? I think, you know, for many people the bottleneck is lack of access to land. The desire is there, and for many people they have land, but they have no desire, and there's this kind of weird mismatch. Is there in you know, where you live, is do you see it more as for expanding? Is the challenge more lack of access or lack of desire or both?
Well, I don't want to generalize necessarily, but I think one of the trends that I do see is that people may have an interest in, growing their own food, in, sort of developing the food autonomy, and even in developing community. But the issue is that because of the way the infrastructure is set up, because of the culture of work that is developed, in some cases, people are spending upwards of 3 hours a day on their commute alone. You know, traffic is just utterly ridiculous, and people are so exhausted by work and by their commute to and from work, they just don't have the time or the energy to, pursue such projects. And that's at least for the working homeowners that I know of. There are, of course, I think a lot of young adults and young people as a whole who, you know, mid to late 20s, even early 30s, mid 30s and stuff, who, still living with their parents. And I mean, that's normal here. At least we do tend to stay in our family homes, at least until we get married, and even sometimes after we get married as well. A lot of multi-generational homes here. But because, housing is so inaccessible, a lot of people are renting if they do move out of the home. And because they're renting, they don't have as much freedom to develop the land in ways that they might necessarily want to. They don't have that freedom. So that's part of it as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All of those seem resonant here as well. I mean, yeah, there are a lot of people. I think the third option that you mentioned is that the desire is there, but either the access isn't there or they're just the bandwidth, right? Like you're working 2 jobs, minimum wage jobs, and just in the how the economy is structured, it's just you're exhausted by the end of the day. Yeah. It's yeah similar. I think it's similar in some ways here. Well, Andrew, I've really enjoyed this. Are there any last words, I guess, or last topics that you want to cover? I want to give you kind of the final platform.
Sure, I just want to re-emphasize what I try to emphasize in all my videos, which is to remember, all power to all people. And I want to encourage people to really explore the ways that they can lend their skills and their interests to, social revolution, to changing our world. Of course, no one person can change the world, but at least we can change our families, change our communities, and that can have a ripple effect. And just by demonstrating a different way of doing things, like I was saying earlier, we can inspire, giving people that taste can inspire further pursuit of action, of change. I think we need to break out of the cycle of activism that a lot of us have fallen into. It's just, circular, mutual aid projects and protests and bail funds and that kind of thing, and look into ways we can build things that are more lasting, ways that we can set ourselves up and really create beacons and pillars within a community that can draw people in and can develop our autonomy and our strength as a collective.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, thank you, Andrew. I really appreciated this. Really enjoyed this. And
Likewise.
yeah, hope we can stay connected and continue the conversation in the future.
Sure. For those interested, you can check out my videos and stuff on youtube.com/Anarchism. And you can follow me on Twitter @_St.
Great. Yeah. And we'll, if you missed any of those links, we will include them in the show notes. All right. Well, until next time, take care.
All right, Jason, take care.
Bye.